program is Dr. Mark Mostert. He's a professor of special education at Regent University in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He is co-director of the Institute for the Study of Disability and Bioethics and is affiliated with the School of Education at Regent University. Dr. Mostert, welcome.
Thank you and good morning. First of all, just a quick thank you, as many people have done, to Alex for organizing what I think for an initial conference is one of the finest initial conferences I've attended. So Alex, thank you very much once again. Also to my fellow presenters, thank you. I have learned a great deal in listening to what you've had to say yesterday and this morning. And I look forward to what we will hear later on today as we go on with several other speakers. And then just one more thing to preface my remarks. The work that we are talking about here is, I think, vital work. It's obviously very hard work and from time to time, as we all know, extremely frustrating work. But I think in the end we need to be encouraged that it is good work, it is necessary work, and if we do not do it, nobody else will. Long before Hitler murdered the Jews, he killed tens of thousands of Germans with disabilities. These citizens, thought to be socially and economically worthless, were the first victims of German state-sanctioned suicide and genocide laws. Once killing techniques had been perfected on German society's most vulnerable, these skills were transferred to the death camps where millions more perished, as we all know. By the time the Nazis assumed power, disposing of people with disabilities was hardly a new idea. There is ample evidence that in the 19th century, both medical and legal debates across Europe included fatal solutions for inmates of asylums, as well as others with physical, emotional, and intellectual disabilities. As we shall see, these historical aspects gathered critical momentum during the first half of the 20th century. As was the case in the United States in the late 19th century, Germany's care of people with disabilities was largely through private or state custodial care, a circumstance that changed significantly with the outbreak of World War I. For example, war conditions meant that in asylums, food rationing cut daily down to unlivable levels of caloric intake to near starvation levels, heating and warm clothing were severely limited, and medicine became scarce. In combination with overcrowding, these factors meant marked increases in communicable disease and elevated mortality rates for people with disabilities in state-run and private institutions. Wartime also changed perceptions of disability among the general public, who increasingly viewed people with disabilities as unable to contribute to the national effort, distinguishing them from those who were able to do so. Unsurprisingly, by the end of World War I, public perception attached higher economic worth to people without disabilities and lesser worth to people with disabilities. Contributing to society via work was good. Being unable to contribute because of your disability meant using resources that you could not replace. Compassion had been replaced by cold economic reality. Public policy followed a similar logic. People with disabilities being cared for by the state were an obvious economic drag, so their numbers had to be drastically reduced. To achieve this aim, many asylum inmates were transferred to outpatient programs or returned to the care of their families. Ironically, the flood of people with disabilities back into their local communities helped feed prejudicial stereotypes that they were different and mostly unproductive. Their infirmities and their sometimes inappropriate or undesirable behavior were almost always considered a threat to public decency and social order. Inappropriate public behavior by people with disabilities was often dealt with through legal action and the criminal justice system, thus melding disability and criminality in the public mind. The juxtaposition of severe economic constraints, levels of economic viability attached to human worth, and the sense that people with disabilities formed a burdensome and often criminal element in society, all significantly added fuel to concurrent ethical debates around euthanasia and sterilization. By the late 1930s, there was open discussion among many German asylum administrators about actually killing inmates, thereby satisfying two pressing needs. First, asylum and outpatient programs would be depopulated, and second, the perceived threat to law and order that these people supposedly posed would be eliminated, thereby restoring public perceptions of safety. Later, the economic worth of human life and the notion of criminality were tied to disability, and this undergirded the Nazi sanctioning of genocide against people with disabilities whose lives were essentially, in their terms, worthless. However, let us back up for a few years to 1920. In 1920, the concept of living beings not being worthy of the life they embodied, entered the public debate in a very significant way. A tract published by two university professors, Carl Binding and Alfred Hosch, titled Permission for the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life, attempted to justify the killing of people with disabilities. They were, quote unquote, incurable idiots, having no human will or sense of living. For Binding and Hosch, the right to live was to be earned, not assumed. I quote, "Their life is absolutely pointless, but they do not regard it as being unbearable. They are a terrible, heavy burden upon their relatives and society as a whole. Their death would not create even the smallest gap, except perhaps in the feelings of their mothers or loyal nurses," unquote. Binding and Hosch's tract complemented the ideas of social Darwinism. Darwin's seminal idea related to biological determinism, that biological traits were genetically passed from one generation to the next. However, other scientists soon posited social Darwinism, which espoused the theory that social traits were passed from one generation to the next. Social Darwinism, therefore, tended to legitimate popular social prejudices as scientific fact. Because social Darwinism held that all visible traits of human difference, including behavioral traits, were genetically determined, just as eye or hair color were genetically determined, so therefore were drunkenness, sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, and any other unsanctioned social behavior, including some behaviors exhibited by people with and because of their disabilities. Predictably, it was a simple extension of these perceptions to the idea that an effective way of controlling or eliminating these social problems was by sterilization, incarceration, and death. Thus, people with disabilities, many of whom displayed inappropriate behavior or abnormal physical appearance, were among the first groups of people targeted by the German eugenic movement. 1933 was to prove an ominous year. One of the first official acts undertaken by the Nazis was the enactment of a sterilization law in 1933, the Law for the Protection of Genetically Diseased Offspring, which decreed compulsory sterilization for persons characterized by a wide variety of disabilities. The mechanism of who decided who should be sterilized resided in 220 three-member regional hereditary health courts, consisting of a judge and two physicians. Obviously, people in or recently discharged from institutions were particularly vulnerable under this law. Approximately 30 to 40% of those sterilized between 1934 and 1936 were patients in asylums across Germany. The sterilization law reached many categories of the hereditarily sick, including the sterilization of people with mental retardation,